We're moving into our session 3 now, which is the breakdown of the welfare state. Very delighted to have two speakers in this session. We're going to start off with Ian Spencer and then move on to Dr. Bob Gill. But we're going to start off with Ian Spencer. Now, Ian Spencer is actually a mental health nurse. He's been a lifelong socialist, and his research interest is in the sociology of mental health and Marx's concept of alienation. And he did a PhD on the political abuse of psychiatry in the USSR, which must have been absolutely fascinating to study. So I'm going to do no more than to hand over to Ian to start off our session 3.
Good afternoon. And first of all, I just want to say a few things about what I'm not going to say, which is I'm not attacking psychiatry. I'm not attacking the treatment of psychiatric disorders, which I take very seriously. And there are people who are really ill, and some of them benefit enormously from medication. I will be critical around that area, but what I want to distance myself from is that kind of school of sociology which says that somehow there are real illnesses and they're caused by organisms that we can look at under the microscope, and then there's psychiatry, which is a bit more slippery at best and hokum at worst. Most of what sometimes come to be known as the anti-psychiatry school actually comes from the right. So people like Thomas Sachs, for example, libertarian right wing. And if you read his work, such as the Myth of Mental Illness, you get a feeling for the kind of trajectory he takes. But his perspective is not only contradictory, but it's also of the far right, as it were. It's about the abstract rights of the individual over and above, for example, mental health law. And I'll come on to mental health law a little bit in a moment. So I'm not taking the kind of line of people like Thomas Sachs. At the same time, I'm going to argue that the nature of psychiatry, the nature of medicine in general, psychiatry in particular, is shaped by the political economic structure of society that gives rise to it. If you like, medicine takes the form it does, shaped by capitalism. But I'm not going to focus much on that as much as the current crisis in mental health care. And from that point of view, I want to look at a little bit of the history of the development of mental health care in Britain, not in any great depth, but I think it's important to understand why we are in the crisis that we are in. This picture is the 8th plate from the Rake's Progress by William Hogarth. It was engraved and published in 1735. The paintings for it are a little earlier. The great period of asylum building, it really dates from the middle of the 19th century. So when Earl Grey was Prime Minister and given his name to tea, there's a big column with his statue on the top in the middle of Newcastle. He was a Whig Earl, and was responsible as Prime Minister, Prime Minister in the House of Lords. Fancy that. That could never happen now, could it? Just the Foreign Secretary. So the origins of asylums, as it were, we can trace back to the development of the Priory of St. Mary of Bethlehem. Bedlam is a contraction of Bethlehem, which became a hospital in 1330 and dissolved with the dissolution of the monasteries. There was actually very few people in it. Even this picture here, which is the second hospital of St. Mary of Bethlehem, had only about 150 inmates when William Hogarth recorded this scene. It's an interesting scene for all sorts of reasons. In the background, you can see two well-dressed ladies who've paid their penny to go and see the lunatics at Bedlam for the day. There's good reasons to believe that this is the syphilitic ward. Tom Rakewell here has scars on him, which is indicative of syphilis. Syphilis in what was then lovingly called general paralysis of the insane, the tertiary stage of syphilis, which causes a kind of dementia. Often causes delusions of grandeur. We see a person here pretending to be the king, little thing there for you Republicans, and there's a person here thinks he's the Pope, and so on. But the reason why I've put it here is partly a gratuitous wish to share a piece of art which I'm very fond of, but also to make a point about the idea of there are real illnesses over there somewhere, and there are mental illnesses which have a somewhat different quality. Syphilis was one of the first things that was identified as a causal organism for general paralysis of the insane, and therefore has a kind of important part. Because since then, really, a lot of the discussion around what mental illness is or isn't often focuses on things like, is it some kind of imbalance in brain chemistry? And what we see is in the discussion around mental illness, the concentration, for example, on psychopharmacology becomes terribly important. The numbers of people being prescribed antidepressants has grown enormously in the last 20, 30 years. It's important to understand that this Bedlam was not really a medical institution, but an institution for the management of the poor. And it wasn't very large, as I say. The development of county asylums, which is what most of them were. They were established under the County Asylums Act, which required county councils to build asylums, and they would be paid for out of the rates. And this is the beginnings really of an association between the provision of state psychiatric care, even if it wasn't psychiatry quite as we understand it today. So the asylums really grew out of the new poor law. If you're having institutional relief of the poor in workhouses, then very quickly, if they get clogged up with people who are too sick to work, either because they're physically ill, in which case you create the poor law infirmaries. So this is the NHS before the NHS, as it were, or you create the asylums because a lot of people who are mentally deranged are difficult to manage within the context of a workhouse. And the 1890 Lunacy Act provided, among other things, for the detention of the mentally ill, but also the important thing is the legal detention of the mentally ill, because there was a great fear that people would just be simply detained in order so that somebody could get their hands on their property. So property relations and psychiatry are also bound up with one another. The very earliest mental health legislation, as it were, was the De Prerogativa Regis, which allowed for the king to take control of the estates of the wealthy who were lunatics or natural fools, what we would now talk of as learning disabilities. This is the hospital where I trained at. It's the former Surrey County Asylum in Coulsdon in Surrey, Netherton Hospital. And what we've seen over the years is a gradual kind of liberalisation, where instead of everybody being committed to a psychiatric hospital, you had the Mental Treatment Act, which created the category of a voluntary patient. And by the 1959 Mental Health Act, when I started as a student nurse here in 1979, 98% of the patients were informal, and 2/3 of the patients were old. It had become, they'd either grown old in the asylum, they'd been admitted many decades before, become institutionalized, and were now of an age where they had nowhere else to go, and so they ended up on what was then lovingly known as psychogeriatric wards. Or they're people who were admitted with, for example, Alzheimer's disease and other kind of dementias. The important thing about this, of course, is it is the decline of the asylums which has created part of the context to the current crisis in mental health care. Enoch Powell was health minister in 1961 and gave his famous water tower speech, in which he talked about the intention of the Conservative Party then to close down the asylums. As a note here, Irving Goffman's Asylums in 1961 was published in the same year in 1961. Now Goffman was launching a critical appraisal of institutional care, and in a sense he was pushing an open door. Most of the left didn't defend the psychiatric hospitals, and for good reasons. In some cases, many of the back wards were pretty grim places. But to put it into context, Thatcher was elected in 1979, and then the psychiatric hospitals began to be closed. Now, remember, the National Health Service didn't come into being like a shiny new pin in 1948. It really was the nationalisation and rationalisation of county asylums, which were paid for out of the rates, voluntary hospitals, which are charitable, and poor law infirmaries, which again paid for but through local taxation. But the closure of the psychiatric hospitals accelerated enormously after the 1982 health workers dispute, and the defeat of the health workers dispute was a kind of key moment in the closure of the psychiatric hospitals. The class struggle and psychiatry are always intimately related. So what we then moved to is so-called community care, which was often kind of neglecting the community, a return to sort of private and charitable care, and people discharged from places like Netherland Hospital, where I trained. Bearing in mind, I mean, I'm not particularly defending them; they were fairly grisly institutions, but they were generally pretty well built. Just to illustrate the point, I was a research associate at Rosebery Park Hospital and watched the transition from St Luke's, the old asylum, to the new Rosebery Park Hospital. It was built under the private finance initiative, and within 10 years of building the new Rosebery Park Hospital, some of it, the majority of it, has had to be rebuilt. Under the private finance initiative, what the contractors did was they built one of the buildings to specification so that it would pass inspection, and then cut corners on the others. And so now they're having to rebuild almost 2/3 of the hospital. It was a good feature, a good illustration of the problems of the private finance initiative. In the end, it was profits really that counted more than anything else. So now what I really want to focus on is the effect of inequality and on mental health. And the period since 1979, well, actually the period since the Second World War, but it has been accelerating enormously since 1979, has been a period of accelerating inequalities in health, as well as inequalities in wealth and income distribution. And the two go hand in hand. There's an interesting feature which is discussed by Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson. I'll give you the kind of references for that later. This is taken from Wilkinson and Pickett, The Spirit Level, and it is published on the webpage of the Equality Trust. If anybody wants to have a look at that, a wonderful resource of the pernicious effects of inequality on health. And what we see here is that there is a close relationship between the level of inequality in a given society and a whole range of different indicators of poor mental health. So if you're looking at incidents of anxiety and depression, or if you're looking at incidents of substance misuse or alcoholism, there's a close relationship between the more unequal a country is, the higher those rates are. So the more unequal a country is, the worse people's mental health is. The worse health is in every respect, in fact. So what we see here, what's important is not so much whether the country is rich or poor, but the gap between rich and poor. Where there is a massive gap, the bigger the gap between rich and poor, usually the worse the mental health is. And so what we see is the USA up here has some of the worst mental health outcomes of any country in the world. And this is a country which spends more of its gross domestic product on healthcare than any other country in the world. Of course, that also it takes into account the fact that many tens of thousands of people have no healthcare cover at all. And so the UK, as one of Europe's most unequal countries, again, has pretty high levels of psychiatric disorder of one sort or another. And the whole period since the Second World War, in particular since 1979, has been of an accelerating increase in inequality, a far the gap between rich and poor. So overall, the people in, say, the poorest 10% have seen some improvement in their life overall during this period. But the people at the top 10%, have seen a massive, immeasurable increase in their wealth, and with it, of course, greater inequalities in health. And this inequality seems to exert an influence which is independent of mere poverty. Once you've got all your basic needs met, this actually seems to be a very important factor in causing high rates of psychiatric disorder. And of course, the political and economic consensus up until 1979 was with a Keynesian model of economics, and what we now see is of a more monetarist neoliberal policy, and it has had disastrous consequences. So the standard kind of statistics, just to give you an idea of it, something like 1 in 4 of the population will experience poor mental health at some point in any given year. The suicide rate currently is about 10.5 per 100,000 in Britain, and that's really quite stable generally. However, it's worth noting that it's one of the biggest killers of young men after road traffic collisions. And just to compare it with other things, I mean, imagine a disease which had a 10% mortality rate. Well, that's anorexia nervosa. It has a 10% mortality rate. 10% of the young women who become ill with anorexia nervosa die. And so this is one little book that you can have a look at if you're interested in taking it further, by James Davies, Sedated: How Modern Capitalism Created Our Mental Health Crisis. And what he focuses upon really, I have some criticisms of the book, but it's a good place to start. So if we just put it into some context, there are around 500,000 people with some sort of serious mental illness. So we're looking at schizophrenia or bipolar disorder and so on. And what he provides is a very good critique of, for example, the way the pharmaceutical industry works. Let's just take one example. Let's imagine I come up with a new antidepressant or something of that nature. Naturally, that has to go through a randomized controlled double-blind trial. What if it turns out that my new antidepressant, we'll call it, I don't know, Spencerfaxine or something, it turns out is actually no better than placebo, or no better than what's already out there on the market of a similar type. If it turns out, then what happens is the pharmaceutical industry simply buries those results. And they wait until they get a study which actually does show the efficacy of that drug. So what we're seeing is actually, whilst we're constantly entreated that there should be evidence-based medicine, what actually happens is the pharmaceutical industries, where it comes to randomized controlled trials, double-blind randomized controlled trials, will often bury inconvenient truths. I've mentioned a little bit about PFI, but I also want to say, well, we already have a privatized healthcare system where effectively it's NHS is almost a kind of branding, and that has a number of important consequences. One is, of course, is that profits come first. And so if we take, for example, the care of people with organic mental disorders, the dementias, for example, instead of we have a situation now where of all neurodegenerative disorders, the dementias alone don't attract the funding of the NHS except under certain circumstances. You have to go through an assessment where you have to be able to show that the care that you need is not merely, as it were, hotel care, not merely housing. But of course, if you've got advancing Alzheimer's disease, your ability to cope and look after yourself is limited. But of course now, your house will effectively be sold to pay for your care. And instead of big old psychiatric hospitals, where if you were cared for with Alzheimer's disease, it was free, you now have a situation where you will be spending anything up to £1,000 a week for your care, and more, in fact, at the top end of the market. But that's a kind of fairly average one. The place where I was a deputy manager charged £800 a week. Ironically, as the deputy manager, I couldn't have afforded to be a patient there. Where you do get talking therapies, they often take the form of things like cognitive behavioral therapy. And again, I'm not attacking CBT. There is clearly an evidence base that it works and is helpful for some people, but it's not the only form of talking therapy that is known to be helpful. But you're not likely to get funding, for example, for psychodynamic psychotherapy, which also has a good evidence base. The point about it is, of course, that since 1979, what we've seen is a transition towards some kind of idea that poor mental health is almost a kind of personal failing rather than a damning indictment of the nature of society. We've seen increasing levels of the prescription of psychiatric drugs. An interesting feature, for example, in the publication of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association between editions 4 and editions 5, was a huge growth in the number of psychiatric disorders which could attract not only a diagnosis, but the prescriptions that follow them. There was an amusing incident when, at a particular year, the new publication of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual number 5 actually reached the US bestsellers list. It actually topped it briefly. Why? Because pharmaceutical industries were bulk buying copies of DSM-5 to distribute to physicians. The whole idea being that, of course, if they could have a conception of mental health that relied upon the prescription of psychiatric drugs, they would, of course, necessarily make even bigger profits. In a sense, the pharmaceutical industry is in an almost unique position because it has what Ernest Mandel calls a kind of technology rent. If you develop a new drug, you have a guaranteed monopoly on producing it for a number of years. And from that point of view, can extract a huge profit from any kind of healthcare system. And in the context of the NHS, it effectively serves as a guaranteed market for the pharmaceutical industry. Obviously, no pharmaceutical manufacturer was nationalised when the NHS was nationalised. These are the two other references I think it's very well worth having a look at, by Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, The Spirit Level in 2009, which looks at a wide range of illnesses, everything from accidents and violence through to bronchitis or whatever else. And specifically the Inner Level, it published in 2018, looks at psychiatric disorders, and I think I've used up my 20 minutes.
We're delighted to have Dr. Bob Gill with us. He's a GP. He wrote the great NHS Heist. I'll say no more than to hand over to Dr. Bob Gill.
Hi, thank you, Carol. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I concur with everything Ian said in his presentation, and he outlines the pharmacological industrial complex. Well, I'm going to broaden it out to the whole of medicine. I will share my screen with you. There's a few slides I'd like to get through. Hopefully you can see that. So, yes, I'm a working GP, still full-time GP, hanging on in there despite the endemic manufactured dysfunction that we're currently having to work in. What I hopefully want to get across are a few key themes, which is how our political media elite have betrayed the public interest on healthcare and so much more, to demystify the NHS privatisation, which has been a deliberately complex and stealthy one, because a full-on frontal attack would have not been politically feasible. hopefully bust a few myths along the line, explain to you what has happened to patient care in the NHS, and where the money's going. And I'm sure you're all motivated people on this Zoom meeting anyway, but, you know, to redouble and to catalyze that motivation even further. So there are a lot of myths about, and this discussion is all around democracy. Well, it would be great to live in one, wouldn't it? We don't have a democracy. We don't have a free, independent press that holds politicians to account, and our politicians are actually, certainly the cabinet, are legally exempt from accountability. There's something called Crown indemnity, which makes sure that if they commit a crime or a public harm whilst following their duty, they do not face any criminal sanction. Political choice, how helpful is voting? Well, you know, the point I was making earlier about global capital above national democracies, I think this slide demonstrates what we're dealing with. Keir Starmer has recently been endorsed by Larry Fink of BlackRock, the biggest investment private venture capital, controlling, I think it's 7 trillion in funds. A lot of these funds, I'm sure, have evaded taxes in the countries that they have been generated in, and also created by the rigged economic system which favors large companies. So he's been endorsed by the capitalists. And on the right of this slide, we have Wes Streeting, who is now blatantly no longer hiding his intentions for the NHS. So we have 2 main parties who endorse privatization. So that's not really much of a democracy. The other key component of our managed fake democracy is the media. The media, large sections of it, are in lockstep with government agenda. You might recognize the 45 minutes headline, which was used to justify the war in Iraq, which was an asset grab to control oil. Some might disagree, but the Nord Stream 2 blowing up was signaled by Trump and Biden that they had every intention to make the EU dependent on US hydrocarbons rather than cheap Russian gas and oil. And it's insane to argue that Russia would blow up their own infrastructure, which cost billions to build. And Seymour Hersh has written about how that came about in some detail. Here we have another lie which was used to hoodwink a lot of people. And, you know, I was campaigning on the streets at the time around the elections and around Brexit. My patients would tell me, I'm going to vote for Brexit because more money will come to the NHS. So this was a very persuasive lie, because there was never any intention for any money to go to the NHS and reach patients. There's plenty of money going in, but the intention isn't to reach patients. And we have the problem of, the Overton window. And what we're not told, this is a big element of how we're controlled. You know, it's not military on the streets or armed police that control us. It's the propaganda we're fed by media that shapes our cognitive understanding of the world. You may recognize this being a picture of Hunter Biden, who foolishly gave his laptop in to be serviced, upon which there was a treasure trove of documents and pictures incriminating himself in illegality, drug taking, hanging out with prostitutes, but also, interestingly, emails which implicated his father in dealings with the Ukrainian gas company Burisma. But that was very inconvenient just before the last US election. So that was hidden from most of us, as is the intentions to privatize the NHS over the last 4 decades. So although they're becoming more blatant, people don't quite understand it. And you know, where we're heading is the model that Michael Moore set out in his film Sicko from 2007, which when I watched it, I sort of shook my head in disbelief and thank God we would never go there. But how little did I know that we were 2 or 3 decades along the process. And what his film concentrates on is not those who are uninsured, but in fact the population with insurance who are fleeced of their money and abandoned when they become expensive and sick by the people insuring them. A system designed to avoid treating sick people. That's what we've copied. So the intentions have very long roots. In fact, there was a group set up in 1948 to combat a public health system called the Freedom and Fellowship in Medicine, which was set up by the private insurance industry to combat the burgeoning NHS. This document is pre-Thatcher's election, 1977, Nicholas Ridley, the Economic Restructuring Group, which talked about reversing the post-war settlement, privatizing national utilities, and a special mention of the NHS privatization, which had to be done by stealth and by breaking it up into separate profit centers. For example, the land, the budgets, and other assets to be prized away separately. One of those assets that was first to be liberalized and profited from was the land and the buildings of the mental health sector, which Ian spoke about. There are other key documents. This is another one from the CPS think tank, put forward by Oliver Letwin, John Redwood, formerly of N.M. Rothschild's Investment Bank and Privatization Unit, who then went on to be MPs under Thatcher. I just want to draw your attention to the helpful summary they put down there, which was making the NHS independent of government, which has happened through legislation, increased use of joint ventures. Now, joint ventures or public-private partnership is a mechanism of funneling taxes into private pockets. That's what it's all about. Whatever the dressing, whatever the plausible narrative, the spin, the intention is to redirect money away from service provision and into profits. So this trajectory, this timeline sets out how we've got to our current predicament. You had the managerialization in the 1980s with Lord Griffiths selling us the lie that the private sector was somehow more efficient in delivering a natural monopoly. We heard about the water companies pumping shit into the rivers. Well, you could say similar of what our health services become. So distorted, no longer prioritizing the delivery of care. So they put in, their idea of efficiency was to put in a bloated management and bureaucratic system, which has raised what used to be an internationally low 4% overhead to something approximating 20%. And estimates in the mid-2000s by York University estimated it'd gone up by at least 10%. So there's a huge opportunity cost by diverting money into the market bureaucracy. Then we had Ken Clark's 1990 internal market, creating this bogus division between GPs and hospitals, whereby fund-holding GPs would exert market discipline on hospitals. What actually happened was you had a two-tier set of a GP system, fund holders having better access than non-fund holders. But it helped to acclimatize the medical profession to this nonsense of the market. You know, not only do we have propaganda, but we have nudge. We have quite manipulative psychological techniques to condition people to accepting what they wouldn't otherwise have accepted. by doing things very slowly and by changing the language and by dressing it up into something that is faithful to the Bevan Beveridge model. We heard a bit about private finance. Our politicians would love us to frame the policy impacts that of their decisions as incompetence. And I think a lot of us slip into this, oh, they made a mistake. They didn't make a mistake. They came up with a scheme, private finance initiative, which did several things. Number one, it saddled the NHS with growing debt, which would become increasingly difficult to finance. And the only way to finance it would be to shrink NHS capacity by selling off land and selling off buildings. The private finance initiative effectively handed ownership of hospitals to the private sector. We were left to service a debt at the end of which we wouldn't own the asset. So transfer of ownership, financial millstone, and alongside that, the biggest covert bed closure program in the NHS's history. So you're shrinking capacity whilst pretending you're building lovely new hospitals. And in some cases, they demolished perfectly good hospitals to replace it with a dysfunctional PFI, gleaming but unsatisfactory building. And then in 2012, we saw a major legislative step forward in terms of their agenda, which was the Health and Social Care Act, which made tendering compulsory. So now entrepreneurial GPs were figuratively put in charge of shutting down hospital services and outsourcing them. Let's not forget, Blair and Brown were the first to outsource clinical services. Ancillary services had already started to be outsourced. But in 2000, you had the Concord Act with the private sector, which, our lovely friends in the private sector, out of the goodness of their hearts, were helping us reduce the waiting list. That is the spin that was put on that perverse decision. So that informal internal market that we've been conditioned to accepting was made explicitly compulsory and external in 2012. And then in 2014, this chap, Simon Stevens, who's now been elevated to the House of Lords, he was formerly an advisor to Tony Blair, then went off for 10 years to work for America's biggest private insurer, United Health Group. And he finished his service there, reaching the heights of President for Global Expansion for United Health. Then he was rehired into the NHS to work on the privatization here and give his former employers pole position in the privatization. He set out his 5-year forward view, then to be followed by the long-term NHS long-term plan, which are blueprints for the insurance system, the managed care system, the system that Michael Moore critiques in his film, which is about not providing care, maximizing profit through denial of care. So Simon Stevens did his job behind the scenes. In fact, a lot of the reforms precede the legislation. So the personnel within the NHS, the processes, the ways of doing business have become entrenched prior to the 2021 white paper and subsequent Act of Parliament in 2022, creating integrated care systems, which are the American managed care system, the subject of Michael Moore's film. So this was a map we made. Just to correct Carol, I made a film. It wasn't a book. It was a documentary, which is on YouTube, The Great NHS Heist. And some of the work the researchers did to help me was to see the impact and influence of United Health, private insurer, within the NHS. And what we found were contracts that involve implementing their software systems, hiring their personnel, training other NHS managers, introducing their algorithms into the back office of the NHS, fronted by their UK subsidiary Optum. So this was up until 2018. I put it to you, it's much further extended now. So the end result of the sort of Tory Labour relay rally of privatisation of the past 4 decades has been to cripple NHS capacity. We have a third of the beds that the Germans do. You know, maybe we're miraculously recover a lot quicker than German people. Who knows? So the capacity is down. This was a graph or a picture displayed in The Economist recently, talking about excess deaths. Some of them they put down to the economic slowdown across Europe. Some they put down to the COVID pandemic, but 250,000 specifically to the UK with their program of austerity on public services and the lack of staff within the service and the cuts to social care. So this is willful. This is willful because if you disinvest in public services, these are inevitable results. These are not unpredictable acts of God. So, you know, every year we hear about waiting on trolleys in A&E. Again, part of the conditioning, part of the normalization, part of the nudging for us to accept this is how it's going to be. The pandemic, the effects of the pandemic and the closure of NHS provision practically, other than for COVID patients, which was a catastrophic policy decision, has made a bad situation worse. At some point towards the end of last year, there were over 50,000 people a day waiting for a hospital bed more than 12 hours from the decision made to admit them. Now, we know studies tell us that for every 80 patients in such a situation, there will be one preventable death. I'd like you to imagine how it feels to be a doctor or a nurse or any medical person working in the hospital where you are seeing people languishing on corridors, not getting the treatment or overview that they need, with a overstretched workforce without the resources to provide care. It is extremely psychologically damaging. So the market reforms, we keep being told the NHS is unsustainable, the market is efficient. Well, I've outlined to you earlier that cost of running the market is sucking out 20% of the NHS budget. The cost of servicing PFI is also sucking out billions away from service provision. We also know that actually investment in healthcare has an economic multiplier effect. You're returning people to being productive citizens. You're reducing dependency that might be there from elderly, sick relatives, and you're returning working age people back into the economy. So this is, you know, to put to one side any moralistic or ideological arguments. This is economic insanity. What the government have pursued is economically self-destructive. This is a graph of spending. But what I want you to pay particular attention to is what happened in 2020 and 2021. The light blue column was what the government would like to present as a boost to NHS spending. But actually what it was a bonanza for the private sector who were given the gift of managing the pandemic or mismanaging the pandemic. Serco, an outsourcing giant, and Deloitte, an accountancy firm, were put in charge of running the pandemic, to run a test and trace system, which the Public Accounts Committee said was a waste of money, 37 billion, and nothing to show for it. 37 billion. It didn't have any tangible effect on the impact of the pandemic. Again, we can't afford to pay the staff a reasonable wage, but at the drop of a hat, we can forgive the abuses of the government loan scheme. Rishi Sunak's decided not to investigate £5 billion worth of fraud. However, to get the NHS to handle the waiting list backlog, which is now, I believe, over 7 million, there's no money. Why? Because they want this crisis. The preventable death and the preventable harm that people are experiencing, either in busy A&E units or languishing on waiting lists, is the essential lubricant to the privatization scam, pushing people into the arms of insurers and pushing them to spend their savings or remortgage their house. This is the push factor. So I just want to come out of this, and hopefully I'll be able to play a short video from Julian Assange. Sometimes the audio doesn't work so great with videos.
Because the goal is not to completely subjugate Afghanistan. The goal is to use Afghanistan to wash money out of the tax bases of the United States, out of the tax bases of European countries, through Afghanistan and back into the hands of a transnational security elite. That is the goal. I.e., the goal is to have an endless war, not a successful war.
So you might ask, what is the relevance to the NHS? Well, the NHS has become another mechanism for reallocating the tax base away from patient care into multinational corporations, often overseas. So the problem isn't the funding. People call for more funding in the NHS, but that's not the problem. It's where the money is going. So endless war is one mechanism for enriching the war machine, but healthcare is another mechanism for enriching insurers, drug companies, and the hospital system in a fully privatized system that we're developing. So this manufactured crisis, where the government has chosen to effectively wage theft up to 30% from doctors and nurses, is having totally predictable effects. What this graph shows is what's happening to GPs according to age. And the highest point there, the pink red line, is what's happening to GPs under the age of 30. Well, they're exiting. They're either exiting medicine or they're going abroad. And who can blame them being saddled with £100,000 worth of student debt, working in a dysfunctional system, which isn't interested in or isn't targeted at delivering the best care for patients, particularly in the emergency and acute sector. But quite perversely, in 2019, there was the British Medical Association was cheerleading for a new scheme, and the acronym is interesting, ARS, ARRS, Additional Role Reimbursement Scheme, where GPs were persuaded it is a good idea that a protected sum of money, which would be ring-fenced, purely to be used for hiring non-doctors to do GPs' work. GPs incentivized to destroy general practice by dumbing down the provision of care. So that was in 2019. And what this article is about is saying, well, the employment of all these non-doctors is leading to GP unemployment. So you have a system whereby there's not enough GPs and there are GPs with no work. This is another article talking about 350 trainee anaesthetists unable to get jobs. Now, these anaesthetists have completed up to 10 years post-medical school training and are ready to be consultants, but there are no consultant posts for them in an NHS which needs an anaesthetist to tackle the backlog of the waiting list. So how is this rational? Why is this allowed to happen? Why don't they create more consultant posts? Well, in a marketized healthcare system, you need a workforce to drift over to the private sector, and the private sector needs a workforce which they can suppress their wages, and it's going to be cheaper to employ a non-consultant who should be a consultant than it is to employ a consultant. So this is a rigging of the system, a quite deliberate rigging of the system, creating artificial bottlenecks. That is not incompetence. So another article talking about the creation of non-doctors or physicians associates to be doing the work of doctors. Now, this is a diagram of Swiss cheese to demonstrate the Swiss cheese model of medical safety. In a safe system, you have multiple layers and very small holes through which the patient might slip and ultimately perish at the end. What our government is doing is removing the layers and making the holes bigger. So when I did hospital training and you were on an acute medical take, the first person the patient would see would be a doctor who's finished medical school, is supervised by senior doctors. That would be the first person you see. Now you don't see that person. You see a triage nurse, or you may even be triaged by a receptionist who decides who's a priority. And that is leading to patient death. Similarly, in general practice, if you're not seeing the GP, you're seeing a non-GP who will naturally have a bigger clinical blind spot. The unknown unknowns. Belatedly, 4 years down the line, the General Practitioner Committee of the BMA has suddenly woken up to the problem with replacing doctors with non-doctors, calling for a cessation of more posts, and calling for them to be regulated, deregulated medical professions running the NHS. Not a good idea. What's the difference? Physicians associates aren't doctors. They have an unaccredited 2-year degree and are allowed to be the first port of call for patients. So this is referring to a study from 2016, which put down the third leading cause of death in America was medical error after heart disease and cancer. Now, how can that be? Well, they have a fragmented system which is there to use the patient as a means to secure income and not to act in a way that helps the patient. So that leads to over-investigation, over-medicalization, lack of continuity of care, and more dead people. Again, I turn back to the media, their crucial role in shaping our understanding and our narrative. So our junior doctors who've had, the student loan debt burden and a third of their wages stolen, working in a dysfunctional, dangerous system, are to be classed as militant. So is my case one purely of looking after our fellow human beings? Well, no, I think we need to appeal to the enlightened self-interest of the whole population. This is a graph showing the rise in annual insurance premium for a retired barrister who had a Bupa policy which cost him in 2014 £6,500, but unfortunately went on to develop a cancer, and by 2022 he was being asked to pay £164,000 a year. Effectively, the insurance company is pricing this person and many people like him out of care. So you're fine if you're cheap to run and you're paying more in premiums than you're taking out in healthcare, but as soon as you become expensive, you're priced out of care, because insurance works by assessing your annual premium based on your health in the previous year. So if you've been sick, your premium shoots up. So these are actually our allies, because when the NHS is gone, or as we drift further down this dystopia, and there's no longer any use of universal provision, well, guess what will happen to the premiums that these people will be asked to pay? They will go up, because they've got nowhere else to go. I don't know if you can see the top of that, but United Health, again, the biggest insurer, using algorithms to decide how long people should remain in rehab, and if staff are 1% out of the target, then they face disciplinary termination and career detriment, because they're not following the algorithm from the insurance company, because they're costing them more money. They're affecting their bottom line. So you can price people out of care. You can make sure the staff toe the line by setting up incentive schemes and punishments. Or you could dump people in the street. Now in America, this is a picture from America, you are legally bound to provide emergency care, but as soon as a patient becomes stable and you find out they have no money or no insurance, you can dump them in the street. And this is a picture of a very confused middle-aged black lady wandering around the streets in the middle of winter, not knowing what was going on. I think this graph sums up what our politicians are willfully doing. Across the bottom, you have the per capita cost of healthcare expenditure. Across the vertical line, life expectancy. So as you spend more in a health system, you have a reasonably linear upward trajectory of the graph, particularly in publicly run systems. But as you notice, as you get closer to the top in the publicly run systems, you're drifting into the beverage models the Bismarck models in Europe, which are more bureaucratic. So you start to get a plateauing out of the benefit. You're putting more money in, but less benefit out. The UK is in the middle of that bunch, and that's after several decades of privatization. This graph is from 2018. The government, our politicians, are copying the US model, which is going to cost us more per capita and kill us off at a younger age. So why do I keep campaigning? This is a picture of two of my patients. The lady, a patient of mine, presented to A&E with a condition which most medical students should be able to diagnose. She developed painless jaundice. Painless jaundice in a middle-aged person should be considered pancreatic cancer until proven otherwise. She was sent home with a diagnosis of a viral illness from a busy A&E department, probably only seen by a junior doctor, if that. The reality was she did have pancreatic cancer. We managed to get her admitted to a neighboring hospital where she languished on a ward for 10 days without getting her jaundice relieved. She had a blocked bile duct because of the cancer. She languished on the ward for 10 days when this should have been done straight away. And during her stay, the hospital staff were pleading with her to complain because they felt powerless within the hospital to do anything. She then went on to have another 3-month delay before having chemotherapy to what was a small tumor. And she missed the window of opportunity to shrink her cancer with chemotherapy and potentially have life-extending surgery. Unfortunately, she's now passed away. But this is the real impact of patients of mine that I cannot ignore. The patient next to her, languishing on my couch in my GP surgery, drenched in sweat, you might be able to see from the blue roll behind his head, was a 30-plus-year-old cancer sufferer who'd recently had chemotherapy and was on the point of collapse, attending my surgery with a raging fever and a very low blood pressure. Now, this is a picture of somebody with neutropenic sepsis, sepsis related to a very weakened immune system because of the effects of the chemotherapy. Now, we live 5 minutes down the road from an ambulance station. We live 10 minutes down the road from an A&E department. It took the ambulance 1 hour to respond to a medical emergency, during which at any time this chap could have gone into septic shock and died in my surgery. That's what keeps me motivated to speak on this subject. But it's tempting to reach for the exit, you know, particularly when you're bombarded with letters like I've received here from 6 separate companies, all asking to buy me out, effectively buy goodwill and take control of my patient list. Because it's the patient list that they want to consolidate and subsequently sell on to bigger commercial interests. So where are we? The passage of the Act last year in July, which went without much comment in the media, which is fully endorsed by Starmer and West Streeting, has created 42 new legal entities called integrated care systems, modeled on the American managed care system, which is handing over budgets, 42 separate massive budgets, taxpayer funded, to private companies, private insurers, providers, and the rest, with the freedom to run the service as they desire, to provide services that they deem fit, and what they don't spend on provision, they can keep as profit. And what they bring into that system is a set of incentives which will give bonus payments to providers such as GPs for not referring patients for operations they might need. So I put it to you, that's a pretty perverse incentive, and that's how the system works. You have this program of de-skilling the workforce so that you have fewer qualified and experienced staff, and you have this denial of care. One way of denying care, of course, is to close the A&E unit, so seriously sick people have to travel further and longer with a high prospect of dying before they ever get to accessing care. And then you have this burgeoning 2-tier system where public confidence is shattered in the NHS, so they reach for the private insurer solution, only to later find out when they become sick and expensive that they will be dumped or pushed out of the system. But of course, everybody knows this is going on because our unions have done such a great job of informing everybody, haven't they? I'm being sarcastic if you didn't detect the sarcasm. Unfortunately, our health unions have been part of the censorship by omission. They've done little to explain what's happened to the NHS, and this can be partly explained by union legislation which has made them weak, but also decisions made by the unions to join something called the Social Partnership Forum, which is an agreement with government to effectively not oppose privatization, signed off in 2006 with Patricia Hewitt, and then signed again, I believe, in 2021, not to oppose the integrated care systems that are now in law. So that article by Stuart Player, published in Byline Times, is worthwhile reading. There are others similarly spelling out the case. So what I would, some suggestions for you there. But I think the key take-home message really is that we have actually lost the NHS. Apart from the logo and the funding stream, the leadership is totally on board with the privatization. The staff are largely unaware of what's gone on, thanks to the media and the union complicity in keeping them ignorant. And it's harder and harder for the medical professionals to maintain a decent psychological state working in a dysfunctional system, the dysfunction in which GPs can't do their own work because they're dealing with this overspill from the hospitals, dealing with people who should have been sorted out but still languishing on the waiting list, a mountain of bureaucracy and micromanagement and performance management, and also asking us and incentivizing us to do things that really aren't in the patient's interest. For example, the mass prescribing of statin drugs. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.